"I'll sleep with you tonight, but I'll have a baby with the woman I love," the billionaire told her. A year later, he saw her with twin sons, and he regretted everything, begging for a second chance. A very powerful story, but before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. I love Mr. Peter. Let's start with love. "I'll sleep with you tonight because duty demands it. But understand this, I will only ever have a child with the woman I truly love." The words landed like shattered glass across Zaire's skin, each syllable drawing blood she couldn't see but felt pooling somewhere deep inside her chest. She stood motionless in the center of their honeymoon suite, the ivory wedding gown that had cost more than her parents' annual mortgage, now feeling like a burial shroud wrapped too tight around her ribs. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled with oblivious celebration, while hers ended before it truly began. Callum Whitmore loosened his tie without looking at her, his movements efficient and detached, as though preparing for a routine appointment rather than their wedding night. His jaw carried the sharp angles of old money and older expectations, his dark hair perfectly styled, even after hours of photographs and forced smiles. He'd been devastatingly handsome walking down that aisle, and Zaire had allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hoping the arrangement her parents orchestrated might transform into something resembling affection. That hope now lay crushed beneath his casual cruelty. "Did you hear me?" he asked, still not meeting her eyes as he draped his jacket over a chair with meticulous care. "I heard you." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. She wanted to scream, to tear the silk from her body and run barefoot through hotel corridors. But her legs had turned to marble. "Good. I need you to understand the reality of our situation." Callum finally turned toward her, his expression empty of malice or guilt, which somehow made it worse. Anger she could have met with anger, but this indifference felt like drowning in open air. "My parents orchestrated this marriage to secure their merger. Your parents agreed to save their company from bankruptcy. We're both trapped, but I refuse to pretend this is anything more than a contract." Zaire's fingers found the seed pearls sewn into her bodice, worrying them like prayer beads. "And Delphine?" His face transformed at the name, softening into something almost human. "Delphine is none of your concern. She's very much my concern when you're discussing having children with her while standing in our honeymoon suite. This suite, this marriage, none of it changes what I feel for her." Callum moved to the bar cart, pouring whiskey with steady hands. He didn't offer her anything. "She's been patient, understanding about the impossible position my family put me in. Once I've fulfilled my obligations here, we'll be together properly." "Legal necessities," Zaire repeated, tasting the words like poison. "That's what I am." "You knew what this was." He took a long drink. "Your parents explained the arrangement." "My parents outlined the expectations. Nobody promised you a love story." She had known, technically. Her father had sat her down in their modest kitchen and explained with tears in his eyes that the Whitmore family had systematically destroyed everything he'd built. The marriage proposal had arrived not as romantic gesture, but as ransom demand. "Give us your daughter and we'll stop the financial bleeding." Her mother had held her hand and apologized for failing to protect her from this fate. But knowing intellectually that the marriage was arranged and experiencing the brutal reality of her husband's contempt were entirely different species of pain. Zaire had still dressed this morning with nervous excitement, had still repeated her vows with genuine emotion, had still imagined they could build something real from this artificial foundation. She'd been a fool. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now we fulfill the terms." Callum set down his empty glass. "You'll move into the mansion. We'll attend necessary social functions together. You'll produce heirs to satisfy my parents' obsession with legacy. In exchange, you'll have access to resources your family could never provide. And in between producing your heirs and attending your parties, in between we live separate lives. I won't monitor your activities if you don't monitor mine. Discretion is the only requirement. Zaire felt something cold and hard, crystallizing in her center, replacing the softness she'd carried into this room. You want me to be silent while you continue your relationship with Delphine, to smile for cameras and play the dutiful wife, while knowing I'm nothing but an inconvenient obstacle. I want us to be realistic about what this is. He finally met her eyes fully. I didn't choose this any more than you did. The difference is, I'm not going to pretend. The difference is, you have Delphine waiting. You have someone who makes this bearable. I have nothing but the knowledge that the man I married views me as a prison sentence. Something flickered across his face, perhaps the ghost of conscience, but it vanished quickly. I'm not trying to hurt you. You're just not trying not to hurt me. She turned away from him, facing the window. There's a difference. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. This was the man she'd promised her life to, and he was already gone, already committed to a future where she existed only as a footnote. We should get some sleep, Callum said eventually. Tomorrow we leave for the mansion. My parents are expecting us for brunch. Of course they are. Heaven forbid we miss a photo opportunity. She heard him enter the bathroom, heard the shower start. The sound of running water felt obscene somehow, too ordinary for the devastation of this night. When he emerged, he moved to the bed without speaking, and Zaire finally forced herself to begin removing her wedding gown, each hook and button requiring monumental effort. The gown pooled at her feet like shed skin. She stepped out and left it there, unable to summon the energy to care about its preservation. What was the point? She'd never show it to daughters with romantic stories about her wedding day. When she finally slipped beneath the covers, Callum was already feigning sleep, his back toward her, the space between them vast and unbridgeable. Zaire lay rigid, staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths and trying to survive each moment until dawn. Somewhere during the endless dark hours, Callum's breathing deepened into genuine sleep, and Zaire heard him murmur a name. Not hers, never hers. Delphine's name fell from his sleeping lips like a prayer, and Zaire understood with devastating clarity that even in unconsciousness, his heart belonged elsewhere. She pressed her hand against her flat stomach, against the place where their children might someday grow, and made a silent vow. Whatever sons or daughters resulted from this disaster, they would never beg for their father's love. They would never internalize the message that their existence was an inconvenience. She would love them with enough ferocity to fill every void he created, would build them strong enough to survive their father's indifference, would teach them that their worth was inherent and absolute. The vow felt like armor forming around her heart, golden, necessary, and permanent. Morning arrived with brutal sunshine. Callum woke first, showering and dressing with the same efficient detachment. He glanced at her once, before leaving the bedroom, his expression unreadable, and then he was gone, probably calling Delphine to report his survival of their wedding night. Zaire rose and dressed mechanically, choosing clothes from the trousseau Adelaide Whitmore had selected without consulting her preferences. Everything fit perfectly because they'd measured her like livestock. She stared at her reflection, searching for evidence of last night's destruction, but her face looked unchanged. The wounds were all internal. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother asking if she was happy. Zaire stared at the question, unable to formulate a response that wasn't either a lie or a confession that would break her mother's already fractured heart. She set the phone down unanswered. Weeks blurred into adjustment and quiet agony. The Whitmore mansion was a museum of inherited wealth, and Zaire moved through it like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Callum maintained his promise of separation, sleeping in the mansion only when necessary and spending most nights at his downtown apartment where presumably Delphine waited. Then came the morning when nausea drove Zaire to her knees, when the bathroom tiles pressed cold against her palms, and she knew with terrifying certainty what this meant. She was carrying Callum Whitmore's child. The pregnancy test confirmed what her body already announced. Zaire sat on the bathroom floor, holding the positive result. Understanding this development would only deepen Callum's resentment. These babies would represent the cage keeping him from Delphine, the obligations preventing his escape. But staring at that positive test, Zaire felt something unexpected bloom alongside her fear. Determination, fierce, unshakable determination. These children growing inside her would be hers in ways that transcended biology. She would build them a foundation of love so solid that their father's absence would hurt but not destroy. And she would survive this. Not just endure, but truly survive, emerging from this disaster with her dignity intact and her children protected. Callum Whitmore might own the mansion and the fortune and the last name, but he would never own her spirit. The pregnancy test slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble, and Zaire pressed both hands against her still flat stomach, where twins grew in defiance of her husband's cruel plans. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Pretense. The Whitmore mansion swallowed Zaire whole the morning she arrived with her modest suitcases, each room larger than her parents' entire house, filled with furniture that predated her grandparents and artwork whose insurance value exceeded most people's lifetime earnings. Adelaide Whitmore waited in the foyer wearing pearls before noon and a smile that never reached her calculating eyes. "Welcome home, dear," Adelaide said, though the word home sounded like an accusation. "I've prepared the East Wing for you. Callum's rooms are in the West Wing, which should provide adequate privacy. Adequate distance, she meant. Adequate space for her son to pretend his wife didn't exist." "Thank you," Zaire managed, her stomach churning with morning sickness she couldn't yet reveal. The secret of her pregnancy felt like carrying explosives, dangerous and volatile, waiting for the wrong moment to detonate. Adelaide's gaze traveled over Zaire with clinical assessment, lingering on her hips and waist as though measuring breeding potential. "The nursery is on the 3rd floor. I've already contacted designers. We'll need to begin preparations soon, I imagine." The presumption stole Zaire's breath. "I haven't announced anything yet." "You don't need to announce what's obvious, dear." Adelaide's smile sharpened. "You've been here mere weeks and you're already looking peaked. Morning sickness, I assume?" "I experienced it terribly with Callum. Hopefully your constitution proves stronger." Zaire felt her privacy stripped away, her body reduced to its reproductive function before she'd even unpacked. "I should rest. Of course, dinner is at 7 sharp. The Whitmore family maintains certain standards." Adelaide turned toward the sweeping staircase, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. "Edward expects punctuality. Callum usually joins us when he's available." The pause before available carried volumes. Everyone knew where Callum spent his nights, whose bed he warmed, whose name he whispered. The staff probably gossiped about it over coffee. The humiliation wasn't just private, it was a public spectacle, performed in slow motion. Zaire's assigned rooms were beautiful in the way museums are beautiful. Impressive but sterile, decorated in neutral tones that suggested no actual person lived there. Her belongings looked pathetic, scattered across the massive space, her modest wardrobe inadequate for the walk-in closet designed to house hundreds of garments. She sat on the edge of the bed, too firm, too large, too foreign, and tried to breathe through the nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with despair. Her phone remained silent. Callum hadn't called or texted since they'd left the hotel. She was his wife in legal documentation only, a stranger sharing his last name and address, but not his life. The afternoon stretched endless and empty. Zaire unpacked slowly, finding homes for her books and photographs, trying to claim some corner of this vast, impersonal space as genuinely hers. She placed her grandmother's quilt across the bed, the only splash of real color and history in a room designed to showcase wealth rather than personality. Dinner arrived with terrifying formality. Zaire descended the staircase at precisely 7, finding Adelaide and Edward already seated in a dining room that could accommodate 30 guests, but tonight held only family. Callum's chair sat empty, and nobody mentioned his absence as though it was expected. Routine, acceptable. Edward Whitmore was quieter than his wife, older by a decade at least, with grey threading his temples and weariness etched around his eyes. He nodded to Zaire politely but without warmth, a man going through motions he'd perfected over decades. "Zaire was just telling me she's feeling under the weather," Adelaide announced, though Zaire had said no such thing. "I suggested she see Dr. Hartwell for a full examination. We want to ensure everything is progressing normally." "I haven't confirmed anything requires examination," Zaire said carefully, hating how her voice sounded small in this cavernous room. "Nonsense. Preventive care is essential," Adelaide signalled the staff to serve the first course. "The Whitmore family has used Dr. Hartwell for generations. He delivered Callum, actually. He understands what's expected. Not what's medically necessary or what Zaire preferred, but what aligned with Adelaide's vision of proper bloodline management." Zaire forced herself to eat soup she couldn't taste, feeling like livestock being fattened and monitored for optimal production. "How are your parents managing?" Edward asked suddenly, his first direct question. The shift in topic felt deliberate, calculated. "They're adjusting to their new circumstances," Zaire answered neutrally, unwilling to discuss how her father stared at walls now, or how her mother cried in bathrooms where she thought nobody could hear. "The acquisition went smoothly," Edward continued. "Their patents have been integrated into our development pipeline. It was the right decision for everyone involved. The right decision. As though dismantling her father's lifework and forcing his daughter into a loveless marriage constituted wisdom rather than cruelty." Zaire set down her spoon with deliberate care, afraid of what might escape if she spoke honestly. "We're very pleased with how things have worked out," Adelaide added. "Once you provide heirs, the merger will be complete and everyone can move forward." Once you provide heirs. Not once you have children, or when your family grows, but clinical language reducing pregnancy to a transactional milestone. "Where is Callum tonight?" Zaire asked, surprising herself with the boldness. Adelaide and Edward exchanged glances. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Edward spoke. "Our son keeps his own schedule. He understands his responsibilities, even if he doesn't always. Embrace them immediately. He's with Delphine," Zaire said flatly. "We can stop pretending otherwise." Adelaide's fork clattered against fine china. "That relationship is a youthful indiscretion. Callum will outgrow it. Will he? Or will I just become better at ignoring it?" "You'll become better at discretion," Adelaide corrected coldly. "The Whitmore family does not air private matters publicly. What happens between you and Callum is your concern. What the world sees is ours." The message was clear. Zaire could suffer privately, but must perform happiness publicly. Her pain was permitted only if invisible, her humiliation acceptable as long as photographed smiles concealed it. "I need air," Zaire announced, standing abruptly. "Excuse me?" She fled the dining room before anyone could object, moving through corridors she didn't know, until she found French doors opening onto a garden. The evening air hit her face like mercy, cool and real after the suffocating performance inside. The garden sprawled in manicured perfection, nothing wild or spontaneous permitted. Zaire sank onto a stone bench hidden behind rose bushes, pressing her hands against her face, trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. The first dinner is always the worst. Zaire startled, finding Edward Whitmore standing nearby, hands in his pockets, looking older and sadder than he had at the table. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I saw you leave and wanted to check that you're all right." "I'm not all right," Zaire said honestly, "but I suppose that's not really relevant." Edward sat on the bench, maintaining respectful distance. "My son is behaving abominably. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, But you won't stop him either. I can't stop him. Callum is his own man, even when he acts like a selfish boy. Edward sighed heavily. I argued against this arrangement. I told Adelaide that forcing two people into marriage would create exactly this misery. But she was convinced the merger required it, that Callum needed proper direction, that he trailed off. That I was acceptable breeding stock, Zaire supplied bitterly. That you came from good family with assets we needed. Edward looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Adelaide views everything through strategy. People are chess pieces. She doesn't mean to be cruel, she simply doesn't consider that chess pieces might feel pain when moved. That doesn't make it hurt less. No, it doesn't. Edward stood, preparing to return inside. For what it's worth, I hope you find ways to build a life here that brings you some happiness. You deserve better than what you've been given. He left her in the garden with those inadequate words, and Zaire sat alone as darkness deepened around her. One hand pressed against her stomach, where two tiny lives grew, completely unaware they were inheriting a disaster. Her phone finally buzzed with a message from Callum. Won't be home tonight. Don't wait up, as if she would. As if his absence was exceptional rather than routine. Zaire typed and deleted a dozen responses before sending nothing. What was the point? He'd made his priorities clear on their wedding night. Everything since had just been painful confirmation. She remained in the garden until the cold drove her inside, until the house had gone quiet, except for the whisper of staff moving through distant corridors. She climbed the stairs to her empty rooms, changed into a nightgown she'd bought for a honeymoon that never happened, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Somewhere across the city, her husband was with the woman he loved. Here, Zaire was alone with the children he'd never wanted, pregnant with twins who would inherit his resentment along with his name. And tomorrow she would wake and do this again, and the day after, and the day after that, each one bleeding into the next, until she couldn't remember what hope felt like or why she'd once believed marriage meant partnership. Her phone lit up with another message, this time from her mother. How are you, sweetheart? We're thinking of you. Zaire stared at the words, unable to answer honestly without destroying her mother's last illusions. So she typed what was expected. I'm fine. Everything's fine. The lie felt like swallowing glass, sharp and wrong. But it was kinder than the truth. She set the phone aside and closed her eyes, one hand still pressed protectively against her stomach, and wondered how long she could survive this before something inside her broke irreparably. Chapter 3. The Price of Inheritance. Zaire discovered the conversation by accident, passing Edward's study on her way to the library, the door slightly ajar, Adelaide's voice carrying through the gap with perfect clarity. Once the twins are weaned, we offer her a settlement, generous enough to make her disappear quietly, calculated to avoid litigation. The boys will be raised properly without the complication of her background. The words stopped Zaire mid-step, her hand flying to the wall for support as the room tilted sideways. Callum's voice responded flat and considering. What kind of settlement are we discussing? Enough to set her up comfortably. A few million, property somewhere outside the city. She signs over custody and agrees to minimal visitation. The boys need stability, not confusion about who their real family is. Zaire pressed her fist against her mouth to contain the sound threatening to escape. They were planning to steal her children before she'd even given birth, negotiating the terms of her erasure like she was a problem requiring efficient solution. The legal implications, Callum asked, and Zaire waited desperately for him to object on moral grounds, to defend her right to mother her own children, to show some shred of the decent man she'd once hoped existed beneath his cruelty. Harrison is reviewing precedents. Plenty of families have made similar arrangements, with proper documentation showing you as primary parent and her as unreliable. We can structure this cleanly. Unreliable based on what evidence? We'll create the evidence if necessary. Adelaide said dismissively. She's isolated, dependent, young. It won't be difficult to paint her as unequipped for proper child-rearing. The boys deserve the Whitmore name without the baggage of her circumstances. Zaire backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps, panic and rage twisting together in her chest. She moved blindly through corridors until she found herself in her rooms, door locked, pressing her back against the wood as though Adelaide might burst through, demanding immediate surrender of the children still growing inside her. Her phone trembled in her hands as she scrolled through contacts, finding the name she needed. Imani Okafor answered on the second ring. "Zaire, I haven't heard from you since the wedding. How's married life?" "I need a lawyer," Zaire said, her voice cracking. "I need the best family lawyer in the city, and I need them immediately." The story poured out in disjointed fragments. The arranged marriage, Callum's abandonment, Adelaide's plans, the twins she was carrying into this nightmare. Imani listened without interrupting, her law school training kicking in as Zaire unraveled. "First, breathe," Imani said when Zaire finally fell silent. "Second, you're describing a situation that requires careful documentation and strategic planning. Third, you're talking to a family lawyer. I specialized in custody law specifically. When can you meet?" They arranged a meeting for the following afternoon at a coffee shop far from Whitmore territory. Zaire hung up feeling simultaneously more hopeful and more terrified. Fighting the Whitmore family meant resources, connections, ruthlessness she didn't possess. But letting them steal her children meant dying in ways that had nothing to do with heartbeat or breath. That night, Callum appeared at dinner for the first time that week. He sat across from Zaire with distant politeness, making minimal conversation, clearly fulfilling an obligation rather than choosing her company. Adelaide watched them like a director, ensuring actors hit their marks, and Edward ate in heavy silence. "I've scheduled your appointment with Dr. Hartwell," Adelaide announced as staff cleared plates. "Tuesday morning. He'll do a complete examination and discuss the pregnancy timeline." "I'll find my own doctor," Zaire said quietly. Adelaide's fork paused mid-air. "Dr. Hartwell has delivered Whitmore heirs for 3 generations. I'm not a Whitmore heir. I'm a person who deserves to choose her own medical care." "Don't be difficult, dear. We're only trying to ensure the best care for the babies. The best care includes respecting my autonomy." Zaire met Adelaide's gaze steadily, refusing to flinch. "I'll select my own physician." "Callum, speak to your wife about being reasonable." Callum looked between them with obvious discomfort. "She can choose her own doctor, Mother. It's not worth the argument." Adelaide's expression froze into fury, but she said nothing more. The dinner concluded in suffocating tension, and afterward, Callum followed Zaire into the hallway. "That was unnecessary," he said. "Challenging her publicly only makes things harder for you. Harder than planning to take my children." The words escaped before Zaire could calculate caution. Callum's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I heard you, in Edward's study, discussing settlements and custody and how to make me disappear once I've served my purpose as an incubator." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "That was just Mother talking. She says things when she's planning, and you were listening, asking about legal implications. You didn't say no, Callum. You didn't defend me or defend my right to my own children. You just wanted to know if it was legally feasible." "I was gathering information." "You were participating in a plan to destroy me." Zaire's voice shook with the effort of keeping it low. "These are my babies, mine. I'm carrying them and I'll raise them. And if your family thinks I'll surrender them for any amount of money, you're all catastrophically mistaken. Nobody's taking your children. Not if I document everything. Not if I build a case so solid your lawyers can't dismantle it. Not if I'm smart and careful and ruthless enough to match your mother's strategies." Zaire stepped closer, looking directly into his eyes. "I married into this family to save my parents from ruin. I didn't know that meant selling myself and my future children. But now that I understand what I'm fighting, I won't lose." Callum studied her, like he was seeing someone new, someone he hadn't anticipated. "What are you going to do?" "Whatever's necessary." Zaire turned toward the stairs. "You should get back to Delphine. I'm sure she's waiting." She climbed to her rooms without looking back, adrenaline carrying her until the door closed and she could finally collapse against it, shaking with reaction. The conversation she'd overheard had stripped away her last illusions about mercy or fairness. The Whitmore family viewed her as a temporary inconvenience, something to be managed and removed, but they'd underestimated her. Zaire wasn't the naive girl who'd agreed to this arrangement believing love might eventually bloom. She was a mother preparing to wage war for her children's futures, and desperation made people capable of extraordinary things. The next afternoon, Zaire met Imani at a small coffee shop in a neighborhood that felt worlds away from Whitmore mansions and family scheming. Imani arrived with a leather portfolio and the competent air of someone who'd faced down worse situations than this. "Tell me everything," Imani said, recording on her phone with Zaire's permission. "Every conversation, every threat, every instance of abandonment or cruelty. We need a complete record." Zaire talked for 2 hours, detailing the arranged marriage circumstances, the wedding night conversation, Callum's ongoing affair, Adelaide's racist comments about her skin tone and concerns about the babies looking too much like their mother, the overheard custody discussion. Imani took notes steadily, her expression growing harder. "They're building a case against you before you've done anything wrong," Imani said finally. "Classic preemptive strategy. Document your instability to justify removal of custody. But they're also creating evidence we can use: abandonment, emotional cruelty, conspiracy to interfere with parental rights." "What do I do?" "You start documenting everything immediately. Keep a detailed journal with dates, times, witnesses. Save every text message. Record conversations when legally permitted. Build a paper trail showing you're a devoted, stable, competent mother. Meanwhile, I'll research the original marriage contract and look for vulnerabilities." Imani leaned forward. "Most importantly, you need to be smarter than they expect. They see you as a victim. Prove you're a strategist." Zaire left that meeting with a plan forming, dangerous and necessary. She would survive this by becoming the opponent the Whitmore family never anticipated: patient, methodical, and absolutely unwilling to surrender. That evening, she sat in her rooms and began writing. Every detail, every conversation, every moment of cruelty or abandonment. The journal filled with her small, precise handwriting, creating a record that might someday mean the difference between keeping her children and losing everything. Her phone buzzed with a message from Callum. "Away this weekend. Business trip. Business trip meaning Delphine, meaning abandonment, meaning another entry in the journal documenting his absences." Zaire placed her hand on her growing stomach, feeling the first flutters of movement, twins announcing their presence. "I'll protect you," she whispered. "Whatever it costs, I'll keep you safe." Outside her window, the city glowed with the lives of ordinary people facing ordinary problems. Zaire envied them their normalcy, their relationships built on choice rather than contract, their futures open rather than calculated. But envy wouldn't save her. Only strategy would, only becoming harder than her circumstances, fiercer than her fear. She picked up her pen and continued writing, building her defense one careful word at a time. Chapter 4. The Birth of Warriors. Labor arrived like warfare, sudden and savage, tearing through Zaire's body at 2 a.m. when the mansion lay quiet, and Callum remained unreachable at Delphine's apartment. The contractions came fast, each one stealing her breath, and she fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. Edward answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Zaire?" "The babies are coming. I need to get to the hospital." Pain ripped through her again, and she gasped into the phone. "Callum isn't answering." "I'm coming. Stay where you are." He arrived within minutes, still buttoning his shirt, finding Zaire doubled over in the hallway, her suitcase already packed because she'd learned not to depend on anyone for help. They drove through empty streets while Edward kept calling Callum. Each unanswered ring, another confirmation that when Zaire needed him most, her husband was somewhere else entirely. The hospital swallowed them into fluorescent brightness and medical efficiency. Nurses hooked Zaire to monitors, tracking the twins' heartbeats, while her body tried to tear itself apart. The contractions intensified until she couldn't think past the pain, couldn't do anything but survive each wave and brace for the next. Hours blurred together. Edward stayed nearby, holding her hand when she needed something to grip, speaking to nurses when she couldn't form words. Adelaide arrived at dawn with her publicist, already managing the narrative, discussing press releases, while Zaire's screams echoed down hospital corridors. "Where is he?" Adelaide demanded between contractions. "Where is Callum?" "Not answering," Edward said grimly. "I've called 12 times." The labor lasted through morning into afternoon, Zaire's body reaching limits she didn't know existed. The twins showed distress, their heartbeats fluctuating dangerously, and doctors discussed emergency intervention with terminology that sounded like death warnings. "We need to do a cesarean," the doctor said finally. "The babies can't handle much more stress." They wheeled Zaire into surgery, and the last thing she remembered before anesthesia pulled her under was Edward squeezing her hand and promising she'd wake up, promising her babies would be all right. And she wanted to believe him, but terror filled her throat like drowning. When consciousness returned, everything hurt. A nurse's face swam into focus above her, smiling with professional reassurance. "You're in recovery. The surgery went well. Your babies are in the NICU. They arrived early and need extra support, but they're fighters. Are they alive?" The questions scraped out of Zaire's raw throat. "Very much alive. 2 beautiful boys, Jack and John, her sons. Real and breathing and existing outside her body now. Tiny warriors who'd entered the world weeks too soon into circumstances that would shape their entire lives." "Can I see them?" "Soon. You need to stabilize first." Hours passed before they wheeled Zaire to the NICU, and nothing prepared her for the sight of her sons in plastic incubators, so small and fragile with tubes and wires monitoring their every breath. Jack was slightly larger, his face scrunched in perpetual fury at being born too soon. John seemed calmer, his tiny fists curled peacefully despite the medical intervention keeping him alive. "They're perfect," Zaire whispered, pressing her hand against Jack's incubator, wishing she could hold him, but knowing the barriers protected him from infections her touch might carry. Edward stood beside her, looking at his grandsons with undisguised emotion. "They have your strength. Look at them fighting. Where's Callum?" The question hung heavy between them until Edward sighed. "He arrived an hour ago." "He's in the waiting room with Adelaide." "An hour ago." His sons had been born the previous day, had spent their first hours of life struggling for survival, and Callum had been somewhere else for all of it. Zaire felt something inside her calcify into permanent hardness. "I don't want to see him. Zaire, I don't want him here." He made his choice. These babies aren't his to claim when it's convenient. She kept her eyes on Jack and John, memorizing their tiny features. "Tell him he can meet them later. On my terms." Edward didn't argue. He left to handle his son while Zaire stood vigil over hers, talking to them through the plastic barriers, singing lullabies her grandmother had taught her, promising them they were wanted desperately, even if their father's absence suggested otherwise. Days blurred into a rhythm of recovery and NICU visits. Zaire practically lived at the hospital, leaving only when nurses insisted she rest, returning as soon as allowed. She learned medical terminology out of necessity, understanding ventilator settings and oxygen saturation and feeding tube schedules, because these were her babies, and she refused to be ignorant about their care. Callum came on the 3rd day, walking into the NICU with visible discomfort, his expensive clothes looking absurd among the beeping machines and worried parents. He stood beside the incubators for 17 minutes. Zaire counted, peering at his sons like they were abstract concepts, rather than human beings. "They're so small," he said finally. "They were born too early because the stress of labor overwhelmed them." Zaire kept her tone clinical, refusing to show the rage burning in her chest. Jack's lungs needed support initially. "John has a heart murmur they're monitoring. Will they be all right? The doctors are cautiously optimistic, but they'll be here for weeks at least." Callum nodded slowly, clearly out of his depth in this environment of fragile life and parental devotion. "I should have been here." "Yes, you should have. I was out of town. Business emergency. My phone died and—" "Don't lie to me, Callum." Zaire turned to face him fully. "You were with Delphine. You chose to be unreachable. Your sons were born fighting for their lives, and you were somewhere else because that's always your choice." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm sorry. Your apologies mean nothing. These babies don't need words. They need a father who shows up, who cares enough to answer his phone, who prioritizes them above his own comfort." She gestured toward the incubators. "Look at them. Really look. They're yours whether you want them or not. They'll carry your name and your features, and eventually they'll ask why you weren't there when they were born. What will you tell them?" Callum stared at Jack and John, something unreadable crossing his face. Then he checked his watch, while standing beside his newborn sons in the NICU, and Zaire understood completely that nothing had changed. Nothing would change. "I have a meeting," he said. "But I'll come back." He didn't come back that day, or the next. Adelaide visited twice, both times with photographers, to document her holding the twins for society pages, ensuring the world saw the Whitmore family's blessed expansion while carefully framing shots that minimized Zaire's presence. Edward came daily, sitting with Zaire during her vigils, holding her when exhaustion and fear overwhelmed her defenses. He was the grandfather these boys deserved, the family member who showed up consistently, who learned their feeding schedules and asked about their progress, and brought Zaire meals because she forgot to eat. "My son is a fool," Edward said one evening, watching Jack sleep fitfully in his incubator. "Your son is many things. Fool is the kindest description. He'll regret this. Someday, when these boys are grown and want nothing to do with him, he'll understand what he's lost." Understanding and changing are different things. Zaire pressed her hand against John's incubator, feeling the warmth of the temperature-controlled environment. "He's shown me exactly who he is. I believe him now." Jack crashed in the third week, his oxygen levels plummeting without warning, alarms screaming through the NICU as medical staff swarmed his incubator. Zaire stood helpless, watching doctors work to save her son, and she called Callum, begging him to come in case Jack didn't survive, and he actually responded, that he was in an important meeting and would try to make it later. Jack survived. The doctors stabilized him and adjusted his treatment and assured Zaire he would be fine. But something in Zaire died during those terrifying minutes, the last fragile hope that Callum might eventually become the father these boys needed. She saved his text message response, added it to her growing documentation of abandonment, evidence for the custody battle she knew was coming. The twins came home after 4 weeks, tiny but stable, ready to face the world beyond incubators and monitors. Adelaide orchestrated elaborate welcome celebrations, inviting photographers and society reporters to document the Whitmore heir's arrival at the mansion. Callum attended the event, posing for pictures with his sons, playing devoted father for the cameras. Then he left for dinner with Delphine, and Zaire sat alone in the nursery that night, holding both her babies, understanding completely that she was their only true parent, that she needed to become strong enough to be both mother and father, because Callum had already chosen his path. "I've got you," she whispered to Jack and John, their small bodies warm against her chest. "You're mine and I'll protect you from everything. even from the man who should have loved you. Outside the nursery, the mansion continued its cold perfection, and somewhere across the city, Callum was laughing with Delphine about freedom and eventually. But here, in this room that Zaire had claimed with her presence and devotion, three survivors held each other and prepared for the war ahead. Chapter 5. The Cost of Silence. The twins' first months unfolded in relentless exhaustion and fierce love. Jack proved colicky, screaming for hours, despite Zaire's desperate attempts at comfort, while John ate poorly and stopped gaining weight, falling off his growth curve until doctors discovered a dairy sensitivity requiring specialized formula. Through every crisis, every midnight panic, every moment when Zaire thought she might shatter from sleep deprivation, Callum remained conspicuously absent. His phone went to voicemail during emergencies. His text responses arrived hours or days late. He treated the mansion as a hotel where he occasionally slept but never truly inhabited, his presence so rare that Jack and John didn't recognize him. Crying when he tried to hold them during his infrequent appearances, Adelaide hovered with toxic control, hiring nannies Zaire didn't want and critiquing every parenting choice. Breast milk isn't enough. You should supplement with formula. The babies need proper nutrition, not your stubborn insistence on doing everything yourself. They're getting proper nutrition, Zaire said through gritted teeth, adjusting Jack, who was finally sleeping against her shoulder after 2 hours of crying. You look exhausted. The nannies are here to help. Stop trying to martyr yourself. I'm not martyring myself. I'm raising my sons. You're being unreasonable. Adelaide's voice sharpened. The Whitmore family has resources. Use them. But the nannies Adelaide hired reported back to her, providing detailed accounts of Zaire's parenting that Adelaide catalogued like evidence. How often the babies cried, whether Zaire seemed overwhelmed. Any moment that could be twisted into proof of inadequacy. Zaire recognized the strategy, build a case showing her inability to cope, document her struggles, use her exhaustion against her. So she fired the nannies over Adelaide's fury and hired her own help. Women she vetted carefully, who understood they worked for her rather than the Whitmore matriarch. During these months, Zaire found an unexpected ally in Imani, who visited regularly under the guise of friendship, helping with the twins while strategizing custody protection. They compiled documentation systematically, photographs time-stamped showing Zaire's consistent presence, medical records listing her as primary caregiver, communication logs proving Callum's abandonment. You're building a fortress, Imani said one evening, rocking John while Zaire nursed Jack. Every piece of evidence strengthens your position, but you need to be prepared for them to fight dirty. I expect nothing else from Adelaide. I mean Callum, too. If forced to choose between you and Delphine, between responsibility and freedom, he's already shown you where his priorities lie. Don't underestimate his willingness to hurt you further. The warning proved prophetic when tabloid photographs appeared, showing Callum and Delphine on a yacht in Greece. Clearly intimate, obviously together. The images circulated on social media with cruel speculation about his marriage. Commenters discussing his trapped situation and sympathizing with his desire for genuine love. Adelaide appeared in Zaire's sitting room that afternoon, carrying a legal document. Sign this. What is it? A non-disclosure agreement. You agree not to discuss family matters publicly in exchange for an increased household allowance. Zaire scanned the dense legal language, recognizing the trap immediately. Signing meant surrendering her right to defend herself, accepting payment for silence about Callum's abandonment and Adelaide's cruelty. No. Don't be foolish. The allowance is generous. I'm not for sale. Zaire handed back the unsigned document. Not anymore. You bought my marriage through circumstances, but you can't buy my silence. Adelaide's expression turned glacial. You're making a mistake. The Whitmore family protects its interests. If you become a liability, we'll handle you accordingly. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Sign the agreement or accept the consequences. I'll take the consequences. Zaire stood, Jack sleeping in her arms, and faced her mother-in-law with newfound courage, born from protecting her children. I've documented everything, every racist comment about the boys looking too much like me, every threat about taking them away, every instance of Callum's abandonment. You want to fight me in court? I'll make sure the judge sees exactly what kind of family you are. Adelaide's hand trembled slightly. You're in over your head. Maybe, but I'll drown fighting before I'll surrender. The confrontation ended with Adelaide leaving in fury and Zaire collapsing into a chair, adrenaline crash making her shake. She'd just declared war on one of the city's most powerful families while exhausted and isolated and terrified. But what choice did she have? Surrender meant losing Jack and John, and that was unthinkable. That evening, Imani arrived for their scheduled consultation and found Zaire near breaking. Adelaide tried to buy my silence. I refused. Now she'll escalate. Good. Imani's certainty surprised her. You want them to escalate. Every action they take creates more evidence. Let them threaten and scheme while you remain calm and documented. The angrier they get, the sloppier they become. I'm terrified. Terror means you understand the stakes. Use it, let it sharpen you. Imani pulled out her portfolio. I've been researching the marriage contract. Your father's company wasn't just bankrupted. It was deliberately sabotaged through supply chain manipulation and credit interference. The Whitmores created the crisis they claimed to solve. That's illegal, possibly criminal. It makes your entire marriage contract void because it was based on coercion. Hope flickered in Zaire's chest. Void means what exactly? Means you could pursue annulment rather than divorce. Means the settlement terms don't apply because the foundation was fraudulent. Means Jack and John's custody isn't governed by the prenuptial agreements because those agreements are legally questionable. Can you prove it? I'm working on it. But this is a long game, Zaire, not a quick fix. You need to stay strong, keep documenting, and trust the process. Zaire looked at her sons sleeping in their bassinet, so small and innocent, depending on her to navigate this nightmare. I can do that. I can be patient, but patience proved harder than anticipated. Sleepless nights accumulated into delirium. Jack's colic intensified despite everything doctors suggested. John developed a rash nobody could diagnose. Adelaide's criticism became relentless, appearing at all hours to point out Zaire's exhaustion, her wrinkled clothes. The toys scattered across the sitting room. You're struggling, Adelaide said, during one particularly brutal visit. The boys sense your stress. Perhaps it's time to reconsider the arrangement we discussed. Let them be raised with proper support while you recover your equilibrium. I'm not giving you my children. I'm not suggesting permanently. Just temporarily until you're more capable. The suggestion was poison disguised as concern, an attempt to separate Zaire from Jack and John under the guise of her well-being. And Zaire recognized it immediately. Get out. Zaire, get out of my rooms, out of my space. These are my babies, and I'm raising them, and if you mention taking them one more time, I'm calling Imani and we're filing for legal protection. Adelaide's mask slipped, revealing naked fury beneath her refined exterior. You have no idea what you're risking. I'm risking everything to keep my sons. That should tell you exactly how far I'm willing to go. After Adelaide left, Zaire locked her door and sat on the floor holding Jack and John, crying with exhaustion and fear and determination. She was drowning but couldn't show it, was breaking but had to stay whole, was terrified but needed to seem strong. Her phone buzzed with a message from Callum. Heard you're refusing to cooperate with Mother. Don't make things harder than necessary. She stared at the text, at the casual dismissal of her fight for their children, then typed back with shaking hands, Your sons are 7 months old, and you've held them maybe 10 times total. You don't get to lecture me about cooperation. His response came immediately. This hostility isn't helping anyone. Your abandonment isn't helping your sons." No response after that. Just silence, which somehow hurt worse than arguing, because at least arguing meant he cared enough to engage. Zaire set her phone aside and returned to the endless work of mothering, feeding, changing, soothing, loving these two tiny humans who'd inherited a disaster they didn't choose. And she made another vow, silent but fierce. She would survive this darkness, would emerge strong enough to give Jack and John the childhood they deserved, would transform this hell into a foundation for their futures, because that's what mothers did. They survived the unsurvivable for their children. Chapter 6. The Separation of Truths. Zaire filed for legal separation on a Tuesday morning while Adelaide attended a charity luncheon. The timing deliberate, strategic. Imani handled the paperwork efficiently, ensuring every specification protected Zaire's interests. Primary physical custody of Jack and John, child support calculations, access to marital assets for child-related expenses. Callum received the documents at his office and called within the hour, his voice tight with restrained anger. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Establishing legal protections for our sons." Zaire kept her tone neutral, refusing to match his agitation. "And for myself. Legal separation means we're married on paper only. Means I'm not subjecting our children to the pretense that we're a functional family. Means I'm documenting your abandonment formally. This is unnecessary. It's absolutely necessary. You spend 4 nights a week with Delphine. You've missed doctor appointments, missed milestones, missed entire months of your sons' lives. I'm simply making official what's already reality. Your mother is going to what? Threaten me more than she already has? Try harder to take my children. Adelaide has been planning this for months. I'm just controlling the narrative before she can." Silence stretched across the line before Callum spoke again, sounding tired. "Where will you live?" "The guest cottage. I've already arranged it with Edward." Edward knew about this. "Edward understands I'm protecting his grandsons. Maybe you should try understanding that too." The call ended shortly after, and Zaire felt simultaneously liberated and terrified. She'd just officially ended her marriage in everything but legal technicality, had claimed space for herself and her sons, had drawn boundaries Adelaide would rage against, but she'd also survived worse. She could survive this too. Moving into the cottage took a single afternoon. The structure was smaller, cozier, hidden behind gardens where Adelaide rarely walked. Zaire transformed the space rapidly, painting walls in warm colors, hanging photographs, creating a home that reflected her taste rather than Whitmore perfection. Jack and John seemed to sense the change, growing calmer in their new environment. The cottage became a sanctuary where Zaire could parent without Adelaide's criticism, where the boys could cry without judgment, where peace replaced constant tension. Edward visited during his morning walks, claiming he wanted to know his grandsons, but clearly also checking on Zaire's well-being. They formed an unexpected alliance, Edward sharing stories about his own loveless first marriage, how he'd prioritized duty over happiness and regretted it for decades. "Callum inherited my worst traits," Edward said one morning, watching Jack and John play on their activity mat. "The emotional cowardice, the tendency to run from difficulty. But you're teaching these boys something different. I'm teaching them they're loved. That's all I know how to do." "That's everything." Edward's voice carried weight of experience. "Children who know they're loved can survive anything else." During these months, Callum's relationship with Delphine intensified publicly. Paparazzi photographed them at gallery openings and charity galas, and Delphine began appearing in lifestyle magazines, discussing her romance with an unnamed billionaire, carefully maintaining plausible deniability while ensuring everyone knew exactly who she meant. Zaire watched the spectacle with strange detachment. That man in the photographs was technically her husband, but he felt like a stranger now, someone whose choices no longer wounded her because she'd stopped expecting anything different. She enrolled in online courses, completing her business degree during Jack and John's naps and after bedtime. Determined to build credentials beyond Whitmore wife, education meant options, meant eventual independence, meant modeling for her sons that circumstances didn't define limits. The cottage became her kingdom, small but wholly hers. She decorated with vibrant fabrics her grandmother would have loved, played music Adelaide considered inappropriate, fed her sons foods Adelaide deemed unsuitable. Every choice was deliberate resistance, small rebellions against the Whitmore way of controlling everything. One evening, Jack took his first steps not toward Zaire, but toward Edward during a visit. The old man wept openly, scooping up his grandson and holding him with such joy that Zaire had to look away, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," Edward said later, after the boys were asleep. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives, despite my son's failures. You show up. That's all that matters. I'm changing my will. Jack and John will inherit through a trust you control. Adelaide won't be able to manipulate them through money." The gesture stunned Zaire. "Edward, you don't have to." "I absolutely have to. These boys deserve protection from their own family. You've shown me what real devotion looks like. I'm just trying to support it however I can." After he left, Zaire sat in the cottage's small living room. Jack and John sleeping peacefully in their shared nursery, and felt something close to contentment. Not happiness. The wounds were too fresh for that, but a sense that she was building something real and good from the ruins of her arranged marriage. Her phone buzzed with a message from Callum. "Can I visit the boys this weekend?" She stared at the request, surprised by his sudden interest. Saturday afternoon. 2 hours. Thank you. Saturday arrived and Callum appeared at the cottage door, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes, clearly out of his element in this small space, so different from Whitmore grandeur. Jack and John studied him with interest but no recognition, and Zaire watched her husband attempt fatherhood with the awkwardness of someone performing an unfamiliar role. "Jack likes the truck. John responds better to music than toys," she offered, trying to help despite herself. Callum nodded, sitting on the floor with his sons, and for 2 hours he tried. He was clumsy and uncertain, but he tried, and Zaire saw something in his face that might have been the beginning of regret. When he left, he paused at the door. "They're beautiful. Both of them. They are. I should have been here more. Should have been different. Should have doesn't change what is." He left without responding, and Zaire closed the door behind him, leaning against it as complicated emotions warred in her chest. She didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. But watching Callum with their sons, she'd seen the faintest possibility that he might eventually become the father they deserved. Just not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but possibly eventually, if he kept showing up and kept trying. Zaire pushed away from the door and returned to her evening routine. Bath time, story time, lullabies. The work of loving her sons continued regardless of their father's journey, and that was how it should be. Jack and John were hers, completely and thoroughly hers, and whatever Callum eventually became to them would be additional, not essential. That certainty felt like armor and freedom combined. Chapter 7. The Illusion Fractures. Delphine's media appearance happened without warning. Zaire was feeding John breakfast when Imani called, her voice urgent. "Turn on the morning show now." Zaire fumbled for the remote, switching on the television mounted in the cottage kitchen, and there was Delphine Ashford, looking radiant and sympathetic, discussing her relationship with an unnamed billionaire trapped in a loveless arranged marriage. "People don't understand the emotional cost," Delphine was saying, her hand pressed dramatically over her heart. "When someone you love is bound by archaic family obligations, when their happiness is sacrificed for bloodlines and mergers, it's devastating for everyone involved." The host leaned forward with practiced empathy. "You're referring to Callum Whitmore?" "I'm referring to a man who deserves authentic love rather than contractual obligation." Delphine smiled with calculated bravery. A man whose family forced him into marriage with someone completely unsuitable, trapping him in a prison of their making. Zaire felt her hands start shaking, spoon clattering against John's bowl. The casual cruelty of being called unsuitable on national television, the framing of Callum as victim rather than willing participant in abandoning his family, the complete erasure of Jack and John's existence. It was character assassination disguised as love story. The woman he married, the host continued carefully, she must have known the circumstances. She knew exactly what she was doing. These arrangements aren't about love, they're about securing wealth and status. She got what she wanted. Now she should have the grace to let him go. The interview continued, but Zaire stopped listening, her vision blurring with rage and humiliation. Delphine had just told millions of viewers that Zaire was a gold digger who trapped Callum, conveniently omitting that Zaire's family was destroyed to force the marriage. The twins existed. That abandonment was Callum's choice, not his burden. Imani was still on the phone. Don't respond immediately. Let me handle strategy. This could actually work in our favor. How? She just destroyed my reputation nationally. She also revealed their relationship publicly and painted Callum as weak. Public opinion is messy. We can shape it. Imani's voice carried confidence Zaire couldn't feel. Trust me, I have an idea. The idea materialized as an interview request from a respected journalist known for investigative integrity. Imani arranged everything, coaching Zaire on what to share, what evidence to bring, how to frame the truth without seeming vindictive. The interview happened in the cottage, cameras capturing the warm, child-friendly space Zaire had created, toys scattered naturally. Photographs of Jack and John displayed prominently. Zaire wore simple clothes, minimal makeup, projecting exhausted honesty rather than Whitmore polish. Tell me your story, the journalist said simply. And Zaire began. She explained how the Whitmore family systematically bankrupted her father's company, creating the crisis they claimed to solve. She showed documentation of the arranged marriage contract, evidence of corporate manipulation, proof that her family was coerced, not compensated. She discussed Adelaide's racist comments about the twins looking too much like their mother, the threats about taking her children, the isolation and cruelty of raising babies alone, while her husband maintained a public relationship with another woman. "Where are Jack and John now?" the journalist asked. "Napping. They're good babies, happy despite everything." The camera panned to show the nursery door, the cottage's obvious signs of devoted mothering, hand-washing drying on racks, bottles being sterilized, educational toys organized carefully. What do you want people to understand? That I'm not the villain Delphine painted. I'm a mother protecting her children from a family that views them as property rather than people. I didn't trap anyone. I was trapped, and I'm fighting to give my sons better than what I received. The interview aired and social media exploded. Public opinion shifted dramatically, viewers criticizing Delphine's privilege and supporting Zaire's fight. Several business partners privately contacted Edward, expressing concern about Whitmore's reputation, and the family's pristine image began cracking under scrutiny. Callum watched the interview from his penthouse, and for the first time, shame crawled through his consciousness as he saw his sons' faces broadcast nationally, realized he didn't know their favorite foods or bedtime routines, couldn't identify their voices or distinguish their laughter. The man in those photographs with Delphine looked like a stranger, and the woman in the cottage looked like someone he'd failed completely. Adelaide suffered a public breakdown at a charity luncheon when board members confronted her about the interview revelations. She collapsed mid-speech, was hospitalized for what publicists described as exhaustion, but insiders recognized a psychological fracture under the weight of exposed secrets. During Adelaide's hospitalization, Edward conducted thorough audits of family finances and discovered his wife had been systematically embezzling from charitable foundations they managed. using donated funds for personal expenses and manipulating tax documentation. The crimes could result in federal prosecution if exposed. Edward arrived at the cottage one evening looking decades older, holding documents that proved his wife's corruption. "I need to ask you something impossible." "What?" "Adelaide's crimes could destroy the family publicly. Prison, financial ruin, generational shame. I'm prepared to make victims whole through quiet settlements, to absorb the costs myself, but I need your discretion. I need you to let me handle this privately, rather than using it as leverage." Zaire studied the man who'd been kind when his family was cruel, who'd shown up for her sons when his own son wouldn't. "What do I get in return?" "A formal partnership, board position at Whitmore Holdings, control over Jack and John's trust fund, real power rather than dependent survival. And Adelaide? Long-term treatment facility. She won't return to the mansion or have access to the boys. She's done causing harm." Zaire considered carefully. Using Adelaide's crimes meant scorched earth, burning everything including resources Jack and John would inherit. Accepting Edward's offer meant strategic partnership, building something stable from the wreckage. "I want everything in writing. Legal guarantees about my role, my control, my son's protection." "Done. I'll have the attorneys draft documents immediately." They shook hands in the cottage's small living room, forming an alliance that would reshape the Whitmore family's future. And Zaire understood she'd just transformed from victim to power broker, from supplicant to partner. Meanwhile, Delphine's book deal became reality. Advance excerpts leaked online, revealing she'd chronicled not just her relationship with Callum, but scandalous details about the entire Whitmore family. Edward's previous marriage, Adelaide's pill addiction, private business strategies, confidential conversations Callum shared during vulnerable moments. The betrayal detonated Callum's remaining illusions. He'd trusted Delphine with his deepest insecurities, his family's private struggles, his fears and weaknesses, and she'd commodified everything for profit. He confronted her in her apartment, finding her with her publisher, literally in bed with him, and realized with devastating clarity that their entire relationship had been theater, that she'd cultivated him as material for her memoir, that the woman he'd abandoned his family for never truly existed beyond his desperate projections. "You used me," he said, staring at her naked beside another man. "Everything was research for your book. Art requires honesty," Delphine responded without shame. "And you were excellent material. Tormented Billionaire, Forbidden Love, Family Dynasty, it's bestseller gold. I told you things in confidence. You told me things while married to another woman and crying about being trapped. Did you really think I owed you loyalty when you demonstrated none yourself?" The argument escalated until Callum left, finally understanding how thoroughly he'd deceived himself. He'd blamed Zaire, blamed Adelaide, blamed the arranged marriage. But the truth was simpler and more humiliating. He'd chosen poorly, repeatedly, and now had to live with consequences. He released a public statement through attorneys condemning Delphine's book and severing all ties, but the damage accelerated. Publishers rushed to release the manuscript, capitalizing on scandal, and advance sales skyrocketed based on Whitmore family drama. Edward suffered a minor heart attack from the stress, spending 3 days in the hospital where Callum maintained unexpected vigil. Father and son talked honestly for the first time in years, Edward sharing brutal assessment of Callum's failures without sugarcoating. "You abandoned a good woman and 2 innocent children because you were chasing fantasy. You blamed circumstances for your own cowardice. And now you're facing the reality that the woman you sacrificed everything for was using you all along." "I know. Knowing isn't enough. You need to become different. Not for Zaire, she's moved on and doesn't need you. Not for me, because I won't be here forever. For Jack and John, who deserve a father worth knowing." The hospital conversations marked a turning point. Edward began teaching Callum actual family management. Not just business operations, but ethical leadership. How to prioritize people over profit. How to build legacy through character rather than just inherited wealth. I'm restructuring my will, Edward told him before discharge, leaving controlling interest in a trust managed jointly by you and Zaire. You'll have to cooperate as equals or watch the empire disintegrate. She'll never trust me. Then earn her trust. Not through grand gestures, but through boring daily consistency. Show up, keep showing up. Prove you're different through actions over years, not words over weeks. Callum returned to his regular visits with Jack and John, requesting scheduled time through Zaire rather than demanding rights. The twins were walking now, talking in short phrases, developing distinct personalities, and Callum was missing everything while trying to learn quickly what he should have known all along. One afternoon, Jack looked at him seriously and asked, "Why you not live here?" The question destroyed something in Callum's chest. Because he'd chosen wrong. Because he'd prioritized fantasy over family. Because he was selfish and stupid and just beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. Because I made mistakes, he answered honestly, meeting his son's eyes. Bad choices that hurt people. I'm trying to do better now. Mama says mistakes need fixing. Your mama is right about that. But Zaire overheard the exchange and pulled Callum aside after the visit. Don't make promises to them you can't keep. They're too young to understand conditional love or delayed redemption. Either you're their father consistently or you're just someone who visits sometimes. I want to be consistent. Wanting isn't the same as doing. Show me first, show them. Then maybe we'll talk about what comes next. Callum drove away from the cottage, understanding that some mistakes cost you everything except the opportunity to do better. And doing better was a lifetime commitment, not a weekend project. He destroyed his family chasing an illusion. Now he had to prove, day by patient day, that he could build something real from the ruins. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction of Power. Zaire accepted Edward's partnership proposal with conditions that would have seemed audacious months earlier, but now felt necessary. Formal board appointment, controlling interest in Jack and John's inheritance trust, complete autonomy over all parenting decisions. Adelaide permanently barred from the estate and from contact with the twins. Edward agreed to everything immediately, and attorneys spent weeks drafting documents that transformed Zaire from dependent wife to equal partner in the Whitmore empire. She attended her first board meeting, wearing a simple suit she'd bought herself, walking into rooms full of men who dismissed her as trophy wife and watching their expressions shift as Edward introduced her as co-trustee of the family holdings. Ms. Whitmore will be overseeing all initiatives related to ethical corporate practices and community investment, Edward announced. Her authority equals mine in these matters. I expect your full cooperation. The board members nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but Zaire didn't need their enthusiasm. She needed their compliance, their expertise, their eventual respect, earned through competence rather than granted through charm. Edward began mentoring her in actual operations, pharmaceutical development pipelines, regulatory approval processes, market positioning strategies. Zaire proved remarkably capable, asking questions that exposed inefficiencies and suggesting restructuring that could improve both profits and patient outcomes. You have good instincts, Edward said during one session reviewing quarterly reports. Better than Callum ever showed. You see people where he sees numbers. People are what matter. Numbers just measure whether we're serving them properly. That's exactly the mindset this family has lacked for generations. During these months, Callum's relationship with Delphine fully imploded as her memoir released to commercial success and personal condemnation. Critics praised her writing, but questioned her ethics, and several Whitmore business associates severed ties over her exposure of confidential information. Callum released a second statement through attorneys, this time threatening legal action for breach of confidence and defamation. Delphine responded with her own statement claiming artistic freedom and accusing him of trying to silence women who dare speak truth about powerful men. The public battle was ugly and painful, and Callum finally understood how thoroughly Delphine had weaponized their relationship, how every intimate moment had been potential content, how his vulnerability had become her commodity. He ended everything definitively, blocking her across all platforms, instructing his attorneys to handle all communication. And for the first time in years, he was truly alone. No Zaire, no Delphine. Just himself and his failures. This isolation drove him to therapy. Not the casual counseling Adelaide had arranged to manage his adjustment issues after the arranged marriage, but serious psychological work addressing his emotional cowardice, his tendency to blame circumstances for his choices, his inability to sit with discomfort rather than running toward fantasy. The therapist was direct. You used Delphine the same way she used you. You needed her to be an escape from responsibility, a reason your life wasn't what you wanted it to be. She needed you to be material for her art. Both of you were performing roles rather than building genuine relationship. What about Zaire? You never gave Zaire a chance. You decided before you even met her that she was the problem rather than the situation. You could have built a real partnership. Many arranged marriages transform into genuine love, but you preferred martyrdom. I was trapped. You were inconvenienced. Trapped is what you made Zaire, pregnant with twins, isolated, fighting for her children while you played victim. Your entitlement is breathtaking. The brutal honesty was exactly what Callum needed. He began attending therapy twice weekly, doing the uncomfortable work of examining his patterns, his privileges, his profound selfishness. Meanwhile, Jack and John celebrated their second birthday with a party Zaire organized in the cottage garden. Callum received an invitation and actually attended, bringing thoughtful gifts he'd selected himself rather than delegating to assistants. He watched Zaire coordinate everything with natural grace, saw how the twins gravitated toward her with absolute trust, observed her mother them with patient devotion, and the contrast between her consistent love and his sporadic attention was devastating. John approached him shyly, offering a toy truck. You play? Callum's throat tightened. I'd love to play. They sat in the grass, Callum pushing the truck according to John's detailed instructions, and for those moments he felt something close to connection with his son. Not love yet, he hadn't earned that, but the possibility of eventually building something real. Jack watched from distance before approaching with a book. Read, absolutely. Callum read the simple story about a family of bears stumbling over words as both twins climbed into his lap, their small bodies warm and trusting in ways he didn't deserve. When the story ended, Jack looked up at him seriously. You are Daddy. The question was so simple and so complicated. Yes, I'm your daddy. Daddies live with families. Sometimes daddies live in different places, but still love their children very much. Mama says love is showing up. Zaire's wisdom, delivered by a 2-year-old with perfect clarity. Love is showing up, not making excuses, not performing occasional guilt-driven visits, but consistently, boringly, reliably being present. Your mama is exactly right, Callum said quietly. And I haven't been showing up the way I should. But I'm trying to change that. After the party, Callum approached Zaire as she cleaned up discarded wrapping paper and deflated balloons. Thank you for including me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because Jack and John deserved to know their father, even if their father didn't deserve them initially. I want to be better. Then be better. Not through declarations, but through actions. Visit every week like you've scheduled. Learn their routines. Show up when it's inconvenient. Prove you've changed rather than just claiming it. Will you ever forgive me? Zaire paused in her cleaning, considering him fully. Forgiveness isn't the question. The question is whether you'll ever become trustworthy, whether you'll ever prioritize these boys over your own comfort, whether you'll keep showing up when it's hard and boring and offers no reward except knowing you're finally doing what you should have done from the beginning. That's a harsh standard. That's basic fatherhood, Callum. The standard only seems harsh because you failed so completely at meeting it. He absorbed the criticism without defensiveness, recognizing truth in her words. I'm in therapy, working on myself, trying to understand how I became this person. Good, keep doing that. But understand that your personal growth journey doesn't obligate me to forgive or forget. I built a life that works without you. If you want to be part of it, you have to earn that privilege through years of consistency, not months of trying. Callum nodded slowly. I understand. And do you? Because this isn't a romance where grand gestures win me back. This is about whether you can be a decent father to your sons. My feelings are irrelevant. Their well-being is everything. I know. Then prove it. Show up, keep showing up. And maybe eventually, Jack and John will trust you enough to call you Daddy without the question mark in their voices. She returned to cleaning up. And Callum understood. He'd just been dismissed, not cruelly, but matter-of-factly. He'd lost the right to her attention, her emotional labor, her concern. Now he had to rebuild from nothing, earning back trust he'd destroyed through selfishness. Edward recovered from his heart attack and began implementing the restructuring that made Zaire equal partner. The company's direction shifted under their combined leadership, prioritizing sustainable practices and ethical pricing, reforming the predatory structures that had destroyed companies like Zaire's fathers. You're building the legacy these boys deserve, Edward told her during one planning session. Something they can be proud of rather than ashamed of. That's the only kind of legacy worth having. Callum attended board meetings now, watching Zaire command respect from executives who'd once dismissed her, seeing her competence that he'd never bothered to discover. She'd transformed from abandoned wife to formidable leader, and he'd missed the entire evolution because he was too busy feeling sorry for himself. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, he caught her in the parking garage. You're remarkable. Running this company, raising the twins alone, building something from nothing. I never realized. You never tried to realize. You decided I was the problem and never reconsidered that assessment. I was wrong, completely wrong. Yes, you were. But wrong doesn't begin to cover the damage you caused. Wrong is a mild word for abandoning your pregnant wife. Wrong doesn't capture missing your son's births. Wrong doesn't describe years of choosing fantasy over family. What word would you use? Cruel, selfish, cowardly? Zaire's eyes met his steadily. But possibly not permanent. People can change if they commit to it. I'm just not convinced you're capable of that kind of transformation. I'm trying. Trying isn't the same as succeeding. Come talk to me when you've been consistently present for a year. Not months, a year. Then maybe we'll discuss whether trying has become being. She got in her car and drove away, leaving Callum standing in the dim garage, understanding that redemption was a marathon, not a sprint, and he'd barely taken the first steps of a very long race. Chapter 9. The Price of Redemption. Callum committed to the marathon with grim determination, establishing weekly visits with Jack and John that he honored without exception, regardless of business pressures or personal inconvenience. He learned their routines through patient observation, that Jack needed extra time to warm up to new situations, that John responded better to music than words, that both boys asked for their mother when tired or scared because she represented absolute safety. The visits unfolded awkwardly at first. Callum didn't know how to play the way Zaire did, didn't understand the elaborate imaginative games or why certain toys mattered more than others. He was stiff and uncertain, trying too hard and overthinking everything, and the twins sensed his discomfort. But he kept showing up, kept trying, kept learning. He read parenting books Zaire recommended, attended child development workshops, consulted his therapist about connecting with children he'd abandoned. Slowly, painfully, he began understanding fatherhood as actual work rather than occasional performance. During these months, Edward restructured his will formally, creating a trust that required Callum and Zaire to cooperate as equal partners or forfeit control entirely. The arrangement meant they had to communicate regularly about business decisions, attend joint meetings, present unified strategies. Working together was strange and difficult. Zaire maintained professional courtesy but never warmth, treating Callum like a colleague rather than her husband. She'd built walls so high and strong that his occasional glimpses beyond them felt like privileges rather than rights. "We need to discuss the pharmaceutical pricing structure," she said during one meeting in Edward's study. "Current markups are unethical given development costs." Callum reviewed the numbers she'd prepared. These reductions would impact quarterly earnings significantly. They'd also make life-saving medication accessible to people who currently die because they can't afford treatment. Which matters more? I'm not disagreeing. I'm noting the board will resist. Then we convince them. This is why Edward gave us joint authority, so we could prioritize humanity over pure profit. They debated strategy for hours, finding surprising alignment on ethical questions even when their approaches differed. Zaire was bold where Callum was cautious, willing to risk financial hits for moral wins. And he realized she possessed courage he'd always lacked. During one particularly intense discussion, Jack and John burst into the study chasing each other, and the meeting dissolved into chaos as the twins demanded attention. Callum watched Zaire shift instantly from business strategist to mother, scooping up John while redirecting Jack's energy, and the ease of her transition highlighted how completely separate their lives remained. "Sorry," she said, still managing both boys. "They're supposed to be napping." "It's fine." Callum knelt down to Jack's level. "Want to show me what you're playing?" Jack hesitated before nodding, leading Callum to the corner where toys were scattered. They played together while Zaire settled John, and for those moments they approximated a normal family, even though normal was something they'd never been. Later, after the twins were actually napping and they'd resumed their meeting, Zaire studied him thoughtfully. "You're better with them than you were. I'm trying to learn what I should have known from the beginning." "Why now? Why not when they were born?" The question deserved honesty. "Because I was too busy feeling sorry for myself to see them clearly. Too invested in martyrdom to recognize I was inflicting suffering rather than experiencing it. That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "I have a lot more honest things to say, but you don't want to hear them." "No, I don't, because honest reflections on your failures don't change the years you missed or repair the damage you caused. They're just words acknowledging what was always obvious." She was right, and Callum had no defense. He'd spent years destroying what could have been, and now had to live with the irrevocable consequences of his choices. The legal separation remained in place, neither divorce nor reconciliation, just formalized distance. Zaire maintained the cottage, while Callum eventually moved into a house near the estate. Close enough for frequent access to Jack and John, but respecting Zaire's independence. During these months, Delphine's book success faded into scandal when fact-checkers identified numerous fabrications in her memoir. She'd invented conversations, exaggerated circumstances, included details that were provably false, and the revelations destroyed her credibility. Publishers pulled remaining stock. Her agent dropped her, and she faded from public consciousness as quickly as she'd emerged. Callum felt nothing about her downfall, not satisfaction, not pity, just profound relief that the chapter was finally, definitively closed. He focused entirely on Jack and John, attending their preschool events, learning their teachers' names, becoming familiar presence rather than occasional visitor. The twins' wariness gradually softened into acceptance, though trust remained distant. One afternoon, John fell and scraped his knee badly. Callum was there, scooping him up instinctively, cleaning the wound with supplies from Zaire's first aid kit, comforting his son through tears. When John's crying subsided, he stayed in Callum's arms, and the weight of his son trusting him with pain felt like redemption might actually be possible. Zaire watched from the doorway, something shifting in her expression. Not forgiveness, not love, but perhaps acknowledgement that Callum was becoming different from the man who destroyed their wedding night. "Thank you for handling that," she said quietly. "He's my son. It's my job. It wasn't always your job. You made it mine alone. I know. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it." No, it doesn't. She entered the room, checking John's bandaged knee. But consistency is starting to matter. Keep doing this, keep being present, keep learning, keep prioritizing them, and eventually, sorry might start meaning something. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even friendship, but it was acknowledgement of progress. And Callum understood that acknowledgement was more than he deserved, and everything he needed to keep trying. The twins celebrated their third birthday, and both parents attended the celebration Zaire organized. Jack and John blew out candles surrounded by love they'd earned through Zaire's fierce protection, and watching his sons laugh with genuine joy. Callum understood that some mistakes cost you everything except the opportunity to do better. He'd destroyed his marriage. He'd abandoned his children during their most vulnerable months. He'd chosen fantasy over family repeatedly and catastrophically. But he was here now, showing up, learning, changing, and maybe, possibly, eventually that would be enough. Not to reclaim what he'd lost, but to build something new from the wreckage. Something smaller but more honest. Something that prioritized Jack and John's well-being over his own desires. That evening, after the party ended and guests departed, Callum helped Zaire clean up. They worked in silence mostly, occasionally coordinating about garbage bags or storing leftovers, and the domestic normalcy felt both foreign and unexpectedly comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" Callum said as they finished. "You can ask. I might not answer. Do you think Jack and John will ever really trust me? Or am I always going to be the father who wasn't there when it mattered most?" Zaire considered carefully before responding. "Children are more forgiving than adults. If you keep showing up consistently for years, not months, years, they'll build new associations. You'll become the father who reads bedtime stories, who attends their school events, who comforts them when they're hurt. The early absence will hurt them, but it won't define their entire experience of you if you don't let it. What about you? Will you ever trust me again? Trust for what purpose? To be their father? Maybe eventually if you prove consistent. To be my partner? No, that relationship died from neglect and betrayal. We're co-parents now, colleagues through Edward's arrangements. But we're not rebuilding our marriage. I understand. Do you? Because you can't charm or perform your way back into my heart. I don't love you anymore, Callum. I'm not angry either. I'm just done with that version of us. I've built a life that works, that makes me happy, that fulfills me completely without you in it romantically. The finality hurt more than anger would have, because anger suggested unresolved feelings, while indifference suggested nothing remained to resolve. "I love you," Callum said quietly. "I didn't realize it until I'd lost everything, but I do." You love the idea of redemption. You love the fantasy of winning back what you threw away. You don't love me, the actual person I am now, because you never bothered to know me. I want to know you. Too late for that. Know your sons instead. That's where your energy belongs. She was right. She'd moved on while he was still caught in regret. And chasing her while neglecting Jack and John would just repeat his original failures in new form. So Callum committed to the only path available, being the best father he could become, even if he'd never be the husband she deserved. It wasn't the ending he'd once imagined, but it was honest, and perhaps that honesty was its own form of growth. Chapter 10. The Architecture of Possibility. The third anniversary of that devastating wedding night passed without ceremony. Callum marked it privately, remembering his cruel words and Zaire's shattered expression, understanding now what he'd been too selfish to see then, that he'd destroyed someone who came to that marriage with hope, who tried despite impossible circumstances, who deserved infinitely better than his contempt. He maintained his weekly visits with Jack and John religiously, learned their favorite foods and bedtime routines, became familiar enough that the twins' initial wariness transformed into genuine affection. They weren't calling him Daddy yet, still using his first name mostly, but the distance was shrinking incrementally. Edward's health stabilized, and together he and Zaire transformed Whitmore Holdings' operations significantly. They implemented policies prioritizing patient access over pure profit, established scholarship programs for underprivileged students, reformed predatory practices that had once characterized the company. "You've built something remarkable," Edward told Zaire during one quarterly review. "A legacy Jack and John can be proud of. Something that does actual good rather than just accumulating wealth. It's what they deserve, and what your family should have been all along." Callum attended these meetings, watching Zaire command boardrooms with natural authority, seeing her respect earned through competence and integrity. She'd transformed from abandoned wife to formidable leader, and he'd missed the entire evolution through his own stupidity. Adelaide remained in long-term psychiatric care, visiting rights permanently severed by court order. Her absence lifted oppressive weight from the family, allowing Edward and Zaire to rebuild the company's culture without her toxic influence. Jack and John thrived in preschool, developing distinct personalities and interests. Jack was thoughtful and observant, preferring books and quiet play, while John was energetic and social, making friends easily and bringing home artwork almost daily. During one visit, Callum attended their school's parent observation day, sitting with Zaire in tiny chairs, watching their sons interact with classmates and teachers. The normalcy felt surreal. Divorced parents attending school events together, coordinating about pickup times and permission slips, functioning as a team even though their romantic relationship was permanently finished. Jack is reading above level, the teacher mentioned during their conference, and John has a natural gift for music. "They're remarkable," Zaire said, pride evident in her voice. "You should be proud. They're well-adjusted, happy children. That's rare given divorced family circumstances." "We prioritize their stability," Zaire explained carefully. "Personal conflicts don't affect our parenting partnership." Driving back separately afterward, Callum thought about that description, parenting partnership. It was accurate and appropriate and nothing like the marriage he'd destroyed. They were colleagues in raising Jack and John, coordinating schedules and sharing information, but that was all they were. One evening, Callum arrived for his scheduled dinner to find John sick with fever, Zaire exhausted from a sleepless night of monitoring his temperature and administering medicine. Jack was being difficult, refusing to eat or cooperate, stressed by his brother's illness. "Let me help," Callum offered. "I can take Jack to my place while you focus on John." Zaire hesitated, clearly wanting to maintain control, but recognizing she was overwhelmed. "Jack needs his pajamas and his stuffed elephant. He won't sleep without it." "I know. I'll get him settled." Jack came willingly, clutching his elephant, and Callum brought him to the nearby house, fed him dinner, ran a bath, read 3 stories before bedtime. His son fell asleep curled against him during the 3rd book, and Callum sat holding him long after, memorizing the weight and warmth of this trust. The next morning, he returned Jack to the cottage where Zaire looked slightly less exhausted. John's fever broke. "He's sleeping now." "Good, Jack was great. We read books, and he told me about school, and he fell asleep during story time. Thank you for taking him. I needed to focus on John without worrying about both of them." "It's what co-parents do." Zaire studied him thoughtfully. "You're different than you were. Actually different, not just performing difference. Therapy helps. And having to face what I destroyed. Keep facing it. Keep being present. The boys need consistency more than they need apologies for the past." Several months later, The twins celebrated their third birthday with both parents present. And during the celebration, John spontaneously hugged Callum and said, "Love you, Daddy." And the word, finally, actually Daddy, nearly destroyed Callum with emotion. Jack watched this exchange before approaching hesitantly with a drawing. "Made this for you." The picture showed 4 stick figures labeled Mama, Daddy, Jack, John, with everyone holding hands. It represented their family not as it was, but as Jack hoped it might someday become, together in some form, connected, if not conventionally structured. "This is beautiful," Callum managed, his voice rough. "Can I keep it?" Jack nodded seriously. "Families hold hands." "They do." Zaire saw the drawing later, saw Callum's emotional response, and something shifted in her expression. Not love, not even affection necessarily, but acknowledgement that he'd finally, genuinely changed. "They're starting to trust you," she said quietly. "Don't betray that trust." "I won't, I swear. Swearing is easy. Maintaining is hard. This is a lifetime commitment, Callum. Not a project with an end point. You're their father forever, which means showing up forever, even when it's boring or difficult or inconvenient." "I understand. I hope you do. Because if you disappoint them the way you disappointed me, I'll make sure you never get another chance." The threat carried absolute conviction, and Callum believed her completely. Zaire had proven capable of surviving his worst and building something beautiful from ruins. She wouldn't tolerate him harming their sons. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution was impossible. Their marriage was finished, their romantic relationship permanently concluded. But they'd built something else: functional co-parenting, mutual respect around their children's well-being, acknowledgement of shared responsibility. It wasn't the love story Callum once imagined, but it was honest and stable and prioritized Jack and John, which made it more valuable than any romantic fantasy. Standing in the cottage, watching Zaire organize birthday leftovers while his sons played nearby, Callum understood that redemption wasn't about reclaiming what he'd lost. It was about becoming worthy of what remained: his sons' emerging trust, Edward's guidance, Zaire's willingness to work with him despite everything. He destroyed their marriage through selfishness and cruelty. That couldn't be undone or forgiven completely. But maybe, possibly eventually, he could build something different from the wreckage. Something that prioritized his children above everything else. Something that honored the woman who'd survived his abandonment by respecting her autonomy. Absolutely. It was a smaller dream than the grand redemption he'd once imagined. But it was realistic and achievable, and most importantly, it centered Jack and John's needs rather than his own desires for absolution. And maybe that shift from seeking forgiveness to earning consistency was the only redemption that actually mattered.